time, I formally welcome you to the Scrum webinar studio series number 19. We have Steve Spearmen with us today, who is a certified Scrum trainer with Scrum Alliance. Thank you, candidates, for joining our webcasters. And this is sponsored by Scrum Master Studio and Product Owner Studio. And this is one of the community initiatives from Scrum, and this would be recorded in case you miss it. You can watch offline. Before I go ahead and introduce a little more about the speaker, let me go to the tech setup because we are in the new norm. You will be muted throughout to give some good experience to the fellow candidates, and you will have a question and answer chat window that you can see. Please use the Q&A window for posting any questions that you may have during the whole part of discussions. Please do not use the chat window because when you put questions on the Q&A, the co-facilitators are going to watch out and we ensure that we will try to answer most of the questions provided within the time box. So in case we miss some of the questions, it's not intentional, it's just that we are running out of time. So we respect the time boxes. And little more background about the tryscrum.com. We are an organization with a strong mission to humanize organizations. We think collective intelligence is going to unleash the superpower of people. So with that intent on mind, we started several community initiatives. I think most of your repeated audience, Scrum Master Studio, Product Owner Studio, and Agile Leadership Studio, with an intent to instill right skills in people so that they can transform the way the world works. We are also a PTN member of Scrum.org. We are also an REP of Scrum Alliance. We are an IC Agile member organization. For more information, please visit tryscrum.com. And a little bit about the studios. You could see a lot of webinar and series is getting hosted. This is not possible without some of the people working at the background. We have a crew of 5 to 6 members working hard in different studios to make sure things are getting cascaded, communicated, and also we are trying to bring in world-class speakers and try to share their perspectives so that this is one of the I would say contributions that we are trying to give it back to the community. So for more information, please visit tryscrum.com and go to studios. You should be able to subscribe our YouTube channel, including some of the studio memberships as well. And I'm very, very happy to introduce Steve Spearsman. He is a certified Scrum trainer. I told you, he's also an Agile coach with over 30 years of experience. He used to say in his own words, he's a recovering project manager. So he spent a lot of time in the IT industry. So before being a certified Scrum trainer, he worked with a variety of Scrum teams. He worked with Bell Labs, Lucent, Avaya, and Cisco Systems, if I'm not wrong, Steve, some of the companies that you worked. And his passion is building happier teams, creating some good business improvements, and managing change. That's how he works in his own words. So welcome once again, Steve. So the webinar is going to be in a little bit structured way. While we encourage questions, but this is going to be more of an open discussion. We're going to go through some of the open changes in the Scrum Guide, and we're going to ask an expert view on what he thinks. So please be informed, whatever we discuss in this webcast is going to be individual views or individual perspectives. This may not be the conclusion that we are trying to extrapolate something out of the Scrum Guide. So please be mindful about that when you hear somebody's perspectives. Steve, without any further delays, I would like to ask you, overall, I keep hearing from the communities and different trainers, the 2020 Scrum Guide changes are very positive. What's your take on that?
Yeah, good morning, good evening, everybody. Yeah, I also think of them as generally positive. There's been a kind of a thing going on for a while in the Scrum Guide where many of you are familiar that we say Scrum is a lightweight framework. And yet there have occasionally been a couple sections of the Scrum Guide that were very prescriptive, just a few. So for example, for a long time, the daily Scrum had to follow those 3 questions, which I personally wasn't a very big fan of. And they made those optional in the November 2017 version of the guide, and then they dropped them entirely in this version. We actually lost several pages of size in the overall guide. It was kind of a full rewrite. And they also dropped the extremely prescriptive how you run the sprint review event. So those were just a couple examples of where they've tried to make it even a lighter framework than before. And I think in general, that's positive. The one thing, and part of the reason why I think we're here, is that when you make something a lighter framework, it makes it even more confusing to interpret at first and to decide, well, what's a good practice? Because more and more they don't have good practices in the Scrum Guide. They, it says those are found elsewhere. So we have to deal with the fact that even though it's there's a lot less detail in there, that doesn't mean there aren't some good things we can all learn from. And so that's what a lot of us spend our time trying to figure out, right? Is what are those good practices that we can recommend?
Thank you, Steve. So I think we are on the right time. Even less prescriptive is the first change I'm noticing in the Scrum Guide changes. And especially, I would like to ask you a question on the product backlog items attributes, right? So many people ask me when I host a different webcasters, especially on the product backlog refinements, they made the language a little bit light. And what is your take on the product backlog refinement, especially?
Yeah, so I mean, I like that it's lighter. They did change one thing about attributes that I thought was a little bit odd. There had been a thing about a product backlog item. There were 4 attributes of that product backlog item, and one of them was some indication of value. And I like that because I think Scrum is very much about value. That one disappeared without explanation in 2020. Now, interestingly, when you look at any of the tools that many of us use, like Jira and so forth, they had never put in a field to support that anyway. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. But for some reason, that attribute disappeared. I guess I suspect, this is just my opinion, that the idea was that how we decide to put things in order as our backlog, as our product backlog, is based on a lot of different ideas, and value is just one of them. And so I suspect that's why they decided not to call it out specially. But that one I didn't love, it's one of the few things there that I didn't totally love. I don't ever want to lose focus on value.
Yeah, so a follow-up question on that. So many people I know in the user voice before they release the Scrum Guide version actually was expecting product backlog refinement could be added as one of the events, right? But when we see the changes all of a sudden, even some of the recommendations has been removed and a little bit of very less prescriptive, right? Do you think this change is positive, or do you think if this could have been a formal event, it would have been more good for the people that are trying to do Scrum?
Well, it would have been clearer, I know that for people, but there is actually some pretty good reasons why it's not an event, I think. And this is a subtle one. This is one we always struggle to get, to get everybody to understand when we do our trainings and stuff, is the idea that it's almost like think of backlog refinement as 2 things. It's an ongoing background activity, because that's sort of the product owner's job, right, is to continuously update or refine the product backlog. And so that's a continuous process in the background, sort of like while the developers are in doing their thing, not that their product owner isn't still talking to them all the time, but they're spending a lot of their time talking to stakeholders, customers, others, and they're essentially updating and changing that product backlog in a continuous fashion. So refinement has always been this kind of 2 things, this background process and typically a meeting or something like that with the developers to kind of look forward a little bit to prepare the top of the product backlog for upcoming sprints. So it's always had this dual nature to it. And so if you'd made it an event, I'm afraid it would have lost that other part, that part about that continuous background activity. Having said that, though, that's always confusing to people. So maybe we could have found some way to clarify it better, that it's, there's kind of a 2-part thing, or something like that. But as it was, they've simply decided to simplify it and definitely not to make it an event, which I agree with.
That's an excellent interpretation, Steve. So if something is going to be very prescriptive in terms of, even people might think that that's the only opportunity to refine the product backlogs, and that should happen as a continuous process. That's the whole purpose of Scrum, right? So things keep changing, and the order is going to change, and the product owner is having a very good authority to change the order of the product backlog throughout the sprint.
It's really it truly is that Scrum is about change, right? And as you're saying, it is very much about the change in the product backlog. I think that's the first one we all think about. But I think a lot of us would also say that the Scrum is also about change in our process continuously. And so it is this kind of, multiple kinds of change. We're changing our things we're working on, but we're also changing how we do our work. And that's a key part of it. So that I think sometimes beginning Scrum teams miss. When you think about the retrospective as the most obvious example of this, one thing that actually disappeared that was sort of interesting, it only appeared in 2017 and then it disappeared in 2020, was this mandatory requirement that there is an improvement item out of the retrospective that shows up in the next sprint backlog. I always felt it was a little heavy-handed, so I'm not entirely sorry to see it go away, but I do like what it was trying to tell us, which is this idea that we also have to continuously change our process, not just our backlog, but we have to continue to evolve our own processes, and that is also mandatory in Scrum.
Yeah, that's a good take, Steve. So I'm moving on to the next change. One team focused on one product, and I would say there's a little bit of a controversial statements from some of the coaches that we spoke after the changes, and even some of the Scrum Masters. Now it's one Scrum team. We have given the accountabilities to three different, I wouldn't say role, but three different accountabilities in the Scrum Guide. Interestingly, they removed the word role itself, right?
Yes.
So, and when I hear some from people about this, and it's a mixed feeling, right? Some people got disappointed, and some people say, "How come an accountability with the whole team?" And there is a little bit of a clarity that is missing in the new guide. So, what is your thought on that, Steve?
Yeah, this one is, I think, a mixed bag a little bit. Now, there was a large series of write-ups, of postings, blog articles from scrum.org about these changes, which for people who are really interested, I definitely encourage reading the 20-something of those that came out. One of them talks about this idea specifically of roles, and it roughly says, roles was not wrong. It was just a little bit confusing sometimes because roles made it sound like job titles, and that wasn't quite right. And so they decided to shift to accountability, but saying the word roles is still not incorrect. It's just maybe not the most helpful analogy. And so I think of accountabilities as what they think of as the better analogy. But if that's confusing to you, there's nothing still wrong, I think, with the idea of roles. The one real change here is that the separate, having a separate dev team as a separate entity has gone away. And that is a moderately important change. And I think the idea was, if you think about it, there was been a thing in the Scrum Guide for a long, long time that said there's no sub-teams allowed inside of a dev team. That's a no-no. You can't have like the testers as a separate team or something, anymore. And none of that's okay. But now I think they've said, well, to take that to its logical conclusion, considering the dev team to be a separate thing isn't really right either, because we're really just one Scrum team. And we have great flexibility about who does the different things now. And that's going to get to this word self-managing in a moment that changed a little bit here too. So in general, I think it is a good change, but maybe a little bit one of the more confusing ones, because it's like, so you're saying there's not a Scrum Master anymore? No, we're not saying that, right? In fact, it calls out that accountability is very much required, which probably means there's someone who has that title, Scrum Master, but it gives us flexibility to do that in different ways.
Very nice perspective, Steve. I think there is a question around that. Yes, we can still call it as a role, but it's just that the authors wanted to emphasize more on the accountabilities, because roles come with accountabilities, and people misinterpret the whole point of splitting into the three roles with three different accountabilities, but just wanted to ensure that things are happening at the end of the day, right? Especially, you talked about the dev team over developers. I'm coming to that question next, because that's a logical point to ask that question. So many people still feel that the development team itself is a wrong way of addressing, because people think development means only coding. They forget that analysis, design, coding, testing, and everything else included to release an increment is development. Now the terminology is developers, so even more there's going to be some friction is going to be between the Scrum team members. They gave more weightage onto the the people that are coding and they forgot the testers, but actually it is not so. So how are we going to convey this message, Steve?
That's a really good one. I think that's going to keep us employed for a while here, Venkatesh, because this is tricky, right? And it's been a problem for a long time. There's been, there's an area where you can suggest changes to the Scrum Guide, and it's a pretty active area actually. And one of the things that has been suggested for quite a while is to get rid of the word development team, and presumably also now developers. I'm sure people would have the same opinion, because to too many of us that means coders. But they clarify very clearly in the Scrum Guide that the word developers means anyone involved in the development of the product process, And so that could really mean, of course, people that we formerly called testers or QA, or maybe people formerly known as analysts or architects, or deployment or ops, or any of these people can now be developers. But that is a little bit tricky because the word has a kind of a common meaning to many of us in the software world.
That's a good take. And interestingly, the guide is, I think the guide moved away from very much software, centric toward a generic. I wouldn't say generic. It is applicable to non-software also, which means Scrum is proven successful in other domains as well, right? Yeah. So we may not know what is the right word to tell, whether it should be developers or it could be team or something else, but that's a good take. Anybody who is getting value from the Scrum, think that you are also included in the team.
Yeah, that's been quite a journey, I think, for a while now, right? The idea that Scrum isn't just for software. We have the same discussion a lot about the term Agile, because when you look at the Agile Manifesto, as we call it, it's really the Agile Manifesto for software development. And so when you go read it, of course, it uses all software terminology. And somewhat ironically, they've chosen to never update the Agile Manifesto, which, when you stop and think about that seems a little bit ironic. The definition of Agile is not updated.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, Steve. So I have a question. Personally, I have a question on this. So now, do you think it's the right time that we should go ahead and do a little bit of a reflection on the Agile Manifesto and see, should we do some changes on that?
I do personally on this one, and I know there's some reasoning, I think, for the people that did this, that it's a point in time, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, because we refer to the fact that really the only true definition of Agile that we have is the so-called 4 values and 12 principles of the manifesto. The fact that they feel a little out of date and some of them could probably be better written and stuff, I think, why would we not show the properties of agility and, also inspect and adapt that? I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that we would. So, and I know there's different opinions on that one, but it would certainly help me in my class when I have to explain why some of the wording is awkward and why it only says software and things like that.
I do agree, Steve. Yes, I can feel it. So the other one, Steve, which I wanted to talk about, the third change, introduction of product goal. I think this is pretty much, many people welcome this change because initially it was a product vision and now it's a product goal. There is a word vision that is removed from the Scrum Guide, interestingly, in this version. Yeah. So how do you see the product goal versus the product vision?
Yeah, this one is a trickier one. It's probably the most substantial real change here that isn't just kind of clarifying and simplifying and word changes and stuff. So the actual addition of a product goal, I do think it's very consistent with what the direction they've gone for a while. For, way back in history, there was no sprint goal either, right? There was only the idea of a sprint backlog, this list of things we had to work. And I think kind of the history on this one is sort of interesting, that, there was a long battle back and forth about whether the sprint backlog was a commitment or not. And the reason was, that people say, well, of course, commitment's one of our values. And they said, well, yeah, the other people said, but yeah, it's a value, but at the same time, we know that complex work, which is what Scrum is generally used for, and which includes almost all software development, for example, complex work is inherently unpredictable. And so because of that, saying that something is a commitment when you can't be totally sure you're going to be able to get it done didn't feel right. And so I think part of the idea of putting that original Scrum goal in was to say there is a commitment, but the commitment is at a higher level of abstraction at this overall goal of the sprint. And so now in, a number of years back, the sprint goal becomes the commitment and the sprint backlog becomes the forecast. And so there's been this path toward a higher level of abstraction going on now for like a decade, I think. And so this is kind of continuing with that. And even vision was not official in Scrum, right? It mentioned it in passing in the past one, things like visions or something. And so it wasn't an official thing. So for the first time, we have something at the product level that is an official thing. And as I've pondered this one, because it isn't super clear, exactly what that product goal is. But as I've read some of the thinking on this and reviewed what I think some of the authors intended here, is I think there's still nothing wrong with having a vision. I think it's actually a really good idea, still considered a best practice, if you will, a good practice, to have this idea of an overall vision that we've described it in the past as 3 to 5 years out. It doesn't change very frequently, things like that. It's a long-term inspirational thing. It's pretty clear that the product goal is a little different than that it's supposed to be something very measurable, very concrete, that probably changes more often than that. So it's almost like it's positioned between this high-level concept of a long-term vision and something that changes every sprint, like the sprint goal. So the examples that you see for this are things that sound like they almost by definition have to take more than a sprint, so that the product goal is different than a sprint goal. But it needs to be something concrete, and it probably changes every few sprints. So it's something like a focus area, something that, we talk, there's some historical terminology like themes or features, we might say, that take multiple sprints to get done. So I think this is at that same level of where, for the next few sprints, we're focused on getting the following major thing done. And it's kind of yet another area of focus for us. So I think this one's a good one, but it's going to take us all a little while to get our head around how this fits in and how there may still be things like visions. And this is somehow kind of in between that idea and the idea of a sprint or a sprint goal.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think I have a relevant question on that, right? There is a question from a candidate. Are you recommending to have short-term goal and keep increasing your bar once it is achieved?
Yeah, I think in a sense it's that, or maybe it's just that these are big things that take multiple sprints to get done, right? That, many of us have, there's an old term in a lot of our industry called BAG or big audacious goals, that we try to have these big audacious or big challenging goals. And so I think this is kind of a formalization of that idea, is that we're expecting a lot from our product owners here, to be really clear, right? This is yet another thing on the back of potentially especially the accountability of the product owner, which is now to help us with maybe a vision, for sure now with a product goal, with a sprint goal, with a beautiful backlog that's carefully maintained, with constantly talking to customers. This is a huge, huge accountability that we're talking about here. But at the same time, we have even more clarification that this is an accountability and that it can be shared with anybody, basically. It used to kind of suggest it was only with a dev team. Now it says, they can widely delegate, and it doesn't say to who exactly. And so I think in some sense, this is good, right? That more and more we're being really clear that we have a structure and we have we have to have goals. We have to keep people inspired. We have to keep people focused. A good product owner doesn't come in and say, here's 6 random stories that I want you to go work, in the next sprint, because that's not inspirational. And now I think it's the same thing. We don't just jerk the team around from sprint to sprint and say, this sprint we're going to work on this, and this sprint we're going to work on this. There's going to be some kind of continuity here, some kind of a larger term focus. And I think overall it's a good thing. I think it's going to take all of us a while to get our head around how to do it well.
I think it's a good point. I think it kind of resonating with me, the Scrum values, focus, courage, commitment, openness, and respect. I think the authors try to put some concrete ways of embodying those values inside the Scrum team by giving some clear commitments and clear focus and better clarity with respect to the product and all.
I was really pleased about one thing about that, Venkatesh, which was there was some people suggesting maybe that the values were going to disappear when they did this major simplification of the Scrum Guide, and they did not, right? And so that was a good thing, because they only got put back in, a few years back, and so I'm really happy to see that those continue to be in there, even in the more abbreviated format now.
Absolutely, Steve. So I think more and more we are going to solve complex problems, values are going to be crucial for us.
Yep, absolutely.
I think I'm going to the next one, which is quite relevant to this, T. We talked about product goal, and we also talked about how it provides focus to the Scrum team. And I think, interestingly, you shared about your perspective on how the vision, even though it's great, it's a complementary practice. It kind of created a vacuum between, the product owner and some of the Scrum teams that they have been working on. And the product goal is going to probably the aspiring, wish is to bridge this vacuum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
a follow-up question on that, a sprint goal, definition of done, and product goal becomes a commitment now, right? And there is a question, if it's a commitment, if it's not a forecast, what techniques or practices are we going to suggest to the product owners to use or picturize this product goal? I think it's a good question.
I do think it's a good question, and I'm not sure we have complete answers to this right yet.
Exactly.
I think we're gonna need some really good examples, I think, to make this more concrete. And so I think we need to come up with some of those. But if you think about it, many of the things that a lot of us work on don't get done in a single sprint, right? A sprint is not long enough to create like an entirely new feature for many of us, right? And so it's sort of like one of the powers of Scrum is this idea of short sprints and short learning intervals and the ability to adapt and change. And this is all really good. But here I think we're seeing the attempt to balance that with continuity of focus and having some idea about how we're working on something bigger, something more meaningful. So I think we're going to start to see that these are examples that, we can come up with, like, that we're working on this entirely new feature for this one customer case that has come up repeatedly, and it's going to take us probably 3-4 sprints to get this done, but this is really going to be our primary focus for the next few sprints, even though we're going to continue to work on urgent defects and other things that come up. And so I think something like that's going to end up being an example of a product goal. It was something that was going to take us several sprints to do. We knew it was. Maybe we don't know exactly how long it's going to take because, again, complex work is uncertain. But I think maybe it's something kind of like that hopefully gets this idea of inspiration and longer term planning a little bit more in the focus than some people might have criticized Scrum a little bit in the past of, there's just sprints. And so, what's the big picture here? And it was always a little unclear. So I think this has added at least a little bit of clarity while still being very lightweight. So.
Yeah. So Vignesh, that was a good question, but we definitely need some more time to emerge what kind of a practices we could suggest, because it's just the guide is just out. And as Steve mentioned, I think I want to recollect your analogy, Steve. You used to say Scrum is beautifully empty.
Yes.
Right? It's like a container and it's beautifully empty, and we got to fill some good practices inside the container. And all we know outside the container is continuously we got to inspect and adapt. And I think product goals is one of those areas that we feel at this point in time, what are the good goals that we can, make up for the product, or maybe what are the good attributes of good product goal? All those stuff.
I think you're right. I think we can probably come up with some attributes if we were to brainstorm them here, right? But, if you think about that concept of a SMART objective, for example, right? I mean, I think a lot of these have a little bit of that flavor to them, even though they don't say that in the Scrum Guide, that sort of specific, measurable, all that kind of stuff. So I suspect we could come up with some of those things as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective, Steve. And I'm gonna ask the last question related to the sprint goal, definition of done, and product goal as a commitment, especially definition of done, right? Most of the Scrum teams that I worked, when I go and approach them, I won't see any concrete definition of done defined, or they may be struggling because of that. There is always a confusion between the product owner and the development teams. Now it's developers, of course, right?
Yeah.
Making the DOD as a commitment towards the increment, what kind of positive changes do you foresee, Steve?
Yeah, I like this one because definition of done has always been a super important thing, even though it hasn't always gotten the attention, like you said, that it probably deserved. It's sort of like one of the things that was different for me about Scrum than the older way of doing stuff, because I used to do a lot of, old waterfall kind of projects over the years, it was sort of like we did things in this very sequential way, but it was almost like we dug ourselves into a hole, right? And the hole got deeper and deeper and deeper, as we coded and hadn't tested and hadn't done lots of other things. And then we slowly dug our way out of that hole. This caused a number of problems, including unpredictability, right? We had no idea how deep that hole was, and we had no idea how long it would take us to climb back out of it. So one of the core ideas of us in Scrum, I think, is the quality is maintained continuously throughout the process. It doesn't go down. It doesn't, have to be kind of resurrected near the end or something. It's sort of like we're in this always potentially shippable state. And definition of done was our best way of trying to capture that. It sort of said, it's not just coded, it's tested, it's documented, it's whatever things we've said, that's our definition of done. And the Scrum Guide has always emphasized definition of done. It gives the team the ownership for it. Specifically, it was the dev team that had the final say on the definition of done. But it also gave the Scrum Master an explicit job to nudge the team, to push them gently toward hardening their definition of done. And I think this has just clarified that again, that it is a super important idea that when we agree to what our quality level is, what it means at the end of the sprint, when we say we're going to be done, we all have the same common understanding of it. And so it's been elevated, to this idea of a commitment, and I think very appropriately so.
Yeah, I think I heard from one of the videos of Ken, one of the co-founders of Scrum. I think it's either it's done or undone. It's binary. There's nothing like
exactly.
Done,
Yeah, there's been a lot of sayings from both of the the original authors here. There's done and there is not done. There is no half done. And this is this old tradition in Scrum. I always think of Yoda here. Do or do not. There is no try. And so it's sort of this idea that the tradition in Scrum is, for example, that if you're using story points, if you get a story 99% done, there's no points in that sprint because it's all about being done. And so I think this is a good continuation of that concept of how important it is to get to done, which, though we should be cautious, does not mean that occasionally the team doesn't get everything done in their sprint backlog. That is still going to happen. And I'm going to say we have to embrace this uncertainty of complexity, which means that we're not always going to get every single thing done that we said, but we're going to do things in priority order. We're going to use these patterns like swarming and other good approaches that are going to help us make sure that we get value done in every sprint, and that we get as close as humanly possible to that sprint goal, even if not every single item always gets done.
I think it's a good summary, Steve. Thank you very much for that. I'm going over to the next change, very interesting one, at least to me, right? Self-managing over self-organizing.
Mm-hmm.
So I will leave it to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, this one is pretty straightforward in their summary here, right? Which says that one of the things that's different here is that now there's this idea that self-organizing kind of meant we decided who and when and how and stuff, but now they've added what. And so this is a pretty big change here in a conceptual sense that says self-managing teams, own the whole thing. What are we doing? How are we doing it? And so while the what has been strongly associated with the product owner role or accountability, now we're saying as an overall Scrum team, we own that. And so the best Scrum teams for a while have used approaches like what's sometimes called co-creation. And the idea being that the best product owners with experienced developers don't tell them exactly what to do. They leave some of the creative part to the team themselves, because this is motivational. It helps teams feel more like owners. And so this is often called co-creation. And it's been considered a advanced but good practice, for Scrum teams for a while. And now I think we're kind of, making that more explicit, that it's okay, that even the development teams are involved in the what, and that's all good. And that, we still want clear direction and leadership from product owners. They still remain accountable. But I like the idea that as an overall Scrum team, we own all those things. Now, the word self-managing is going to cause some angst for some people, right?
Yes.
Because, it's like, wait, no managers anymore? Now, of course, it's not saying that. Though it does make us ponder exactly what the role of a manager is and how that fits, right? And so, so this is going to be true for many more, let's call them new age organizations, they have been pondering this. And almost none of them have decided there's no managers exactly, but some of them have decided there's a lot less than we thought, And so this can cause, as you can imagine, some pretty interesting conversations and pretty sensitive things in a lot of organizations when you start talking about managing. I actually remember way back when I was first a project manager, you couldn't actually be called a project manager in my organization because you had to be a manager to be a manager. And so that wasn't okay. So they had to call it something else. And so this is obviously kind of a sensitive area. But at the same time, I agree with it that what we know didn't work in the past was this idea that somebody tells you what to do and then they look over your shoulders all the time and, and make sure you're doing it and kind of crack the whip a little bit, which was the sort of unfortunate view of management sometimes. And it's not a very good style of management. It never was, but that was often how it was viewed. And here we're saying teams are self-managing. They, stay out of their way, give them some support, give them some, delegate them the right amount of authority to them. But we're really saying they've got this thing. And I think a good manager in Scrum now is pretty hands off a lot of the time, but always there if you need them, so it's probably something like that.
That's a good take. I think one other question I wanted to ask before I move on personally is when we had the term self-organizing, we still talk about a lot, right? They have their boundaries and they can certainly collaborate with the entire Scrum team, and we are having the development team as a separate team. But given the fact that we are changing the terminology from self-organizing to self-managing, um, can you give us a couple of tips, Steve? How are we going to convey this information, especially to the people in the management ladder? Because this is one of the frequent questions that we get from participants.
It is an interesting one. A few years ago, right, we started having these classes in the Scrum Alliance side called Certified Agile Leadership. And I think this was a vacuum, that we had for a while. We knew we were coming in and suggesting things that were very disruptive and that were going to change a lot of things about organizations. But we were only occasionally getting like leaders in, sometimes a Scrum Master class or something, but we didn't have anything formally targeted to that. That's been different now for a couple of years, where we really do have a set of focused training. So I think this kind of stuff needs to get in there as a partial answer, right? And we got to get this stuff in those leadership classes. We got to make sure that leaders understand what is their role here, because we don't want them to hear there's no role for leaders. That's obviously not right. But at the same time, we do want to make clear that it's not micromanaging people anymore. It's not kind of constantly telling them what to do. It's kind of, this is a self-managing team now. So we're going to be a little bit hands off, we're going to be there for them. We're going to maybe do that career counseling function still, we're probably going to make sure they get paid. That's probably a good thing. But Scrum isn't going to tell us any of those details. So we have to kind of together figure out what's this new normal look like when you truly have a self-managing team. Good news, there's some new age organizations out there that have some pretty interesting examples. A lot of you, of course, are probably familiar with like the so-called Spotify model. And I say so-called because they keep changing their model, which is actually a very agile concept.
Yeah, that's a good take. I think there is a lot of management activities that is happening in Scrum. It's just that, the leaders will have to see, how can they create such kind of an environment so that the teams are going to thrive. It's a good take.
Exactly. Yeah.
The next one I'm going to go, there are a couple of questions, but I'm going to come back to the Scrum Master role at the last, because we will never complete this webinar without talking about the Scrum Master role. So do not worry about that. The next one is 3 sprint planning topics. That I think it's pretty straightforward, Steve, but I would like to get your perspective on, especially the why referring the sprint goal. The why.
I think of it as just an expansion of the idea of the sprint goal that was introduced a number of years ago, just clarifying that people are motivated by, we know people are motivated by certain things. And one of the things is some clarity of, of things they like to, if you're familiar with like Daniel Pink's work, right? He says it comes down to autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so purpose, I think, is what we're getting here, right? Is the idea that a good product owner has always helped teams understand why are we doing stuff. And so now that's formalized. And the sprint goal, I think, strongly implied it, and now it's just super clear that it's sort of a mandatory part of this. So I actually like this, that the idea of it being a separate part of the session. I assume this means it's a pretty short thing, right? I mean, it's not like the first half hour is, probably talking why in most cases. But it's still, I like the idea that it's made very explicit. We have to make sure everybody understands the why. And so it was implied before. I think it's just, in my mind, it's a clarification of what was always the intent.
Exactly. So I second you, Steve. I think at least 50% of the Scrum teams that I worked, they just get onto the sprint planning and they don't even talk about the goal. They just talk about the task mastering, right? They just take the task and try to break down stuff. And this is very explicit that without talking about the why part, or why are we going and talking about the how part?
Yeah, exactly. It's
more
and again, I wouldn't interpret as, let's imagine we're going to have a 30-minute lecture on why we're doing things, right? I mean, hopefully it's nothing like that, but just a real explicit, guys, here's what we're all about here. And it really is making clear what was always supposed to be the product owner mindset, but maybe not as clear as it was, as it could be, and maybe is now, that product owners are inspirational figures to teams. They are not taskmasters. They're inspirational figures to the team.
Exactly. So I'm done with the changes, but I have a few questions that is open, Steve, especially with respect to the Scrum Master role. I intentionally parked at the end because I wanted to really get your perspective on the Scrum Master role. The first question is, how do you see the update from servant leader to true leader? That's an interesting change that I observed in the Scrum Guide.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on this one, partly because nobody knows what the definition is supposed to be for true leader here.
Yes.
And so servant leader had been a controversial term for a while. It has some baggage in various cultures and things, I tend to show like this Chet Wrong video, sometimes, and I show this video from the one about the sort of the bad Scrum Master example of, that where he's not being a very good servant leader type, but there's a scene in it where he brings by the coffee or the tea, and this would always cause laughter and especially my classes in India, right? It was like, not bringing the tea around for anybody, but this was sort of cultural baggage, if you will, right, that we had that said that's somebody else's job. And so I don't like that we're getting rid of some of those important concepts that came out of servant leadership. So I hope we can interpret this in a way that says maybe it's more like the term was not helpful for some of us, but that some of the ideas still are, that true leaders don't tell people what to do. True leaders inspire people, that true leaders do use styles that say, I think you're amazing. I already think you're amazing. Now let's talk about what could help you be even more amazing. And so I hope we're still taking the best of what used to be servant leadership and maybe get rid of the term that bothered some people a little bit. But we're again going to have to build up a little bit of a consensus about what true leadership really means.
Exactly. So I was about to ask you that question, Steve. I think servant leader, in my view, is massively misused, as you rightly said. Scrum Master, at least the role is massively misused, that they are there to just serve the team in terms of administrator, kind of an administrative activities and more of a project coordinator activities, rather truly inspiring people and unleashing their intelligence, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's already been clear for a while that's, when you read the guide carefully, that, we're not the people that goes and does charts for the team and sets up meetings and things. That's all just a kind of an interesting little tradition that you could interpret as a type of servant, as things to do. But it's more like we're change agents. We're organizational level change agents. Scrum Masters are not limited to the scope of their team. It's very, very clear about that in the Scrum Guide, that we own overall organizational change aspects. So it's sort of like we're presumably supposed to have a bunch of the Scrum Masters meeting with the top executives talking about how to transition our organization. That's actually what the Scrum Guide is calling Scrum Masters to be, not sort of lightweight team facilitation or something. So I think someday we need to step up to this view that we are high level change agents and we're really helping transform the world of work, which was kind of the Scrum Alliance vision, is that we're about, transforming the world of work.
Okay, so I think in summary, we are saying that true leader sounds more accessible term for many people because there is no vagueness. Indeed, servant leader, we do not know. There are different, versions of servant leadership. We don't know the history. We carried a lot of baggage. So true leader, I think it ties back to the simplification of language, Steve, in my view. Many people easily can interpret what does true leader mean and what are the things that they need to embody so that the teams can really grow.
I think after this minimization here, where the Scrum Guide went down to, under 13 pages or something now, that there's going to be a strong request that we clarify the meaning of the idea of a true leader a little bit, because that is so subject to interpretation that, they might go, oh, well, it's going to be like my leaders, where they whip the team, frequently. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean that. But we're going to have to get some kind of clarification of that, I think, to be helpful here.
Yep. So a follow-up question on the same Scrum Master responsibility. So while the Scrum Guide clearly mentions Scrum Master coaches the team, organization, but did not mention the word coaching when it comes to product ownership. So in your perspective, how do you see this? Is the Scrum Master not going to qualify to coach the product owners? That's the question.
Yeah, I think there's still this idea of the service of that we provide to the product owners, and I think that service still is probably going to include some coaching. It still says some things that are really surprising in there, right? Like you're supposed to know effective techniques for product backlog management. Now, while this is not coaching in the subtler sense of the word, it is this idea that we're going in and potentially, essentially coaching product owners in that kind of a practices sense of how to do their job if they don't know how to do it and stuff like that. So I think there's a pretty strongly implied coaching thing. Now, as many of you who are more coaches know, the word coaching can be pretty subtle because it often means, helping people think through their own approaches and stuff like that. And here, this is a little bit more of that directive style of, but even there, a good Scrum Master, a true leader, is probably going to do this in a subtle way, right? They're going to come in and say, hey, I've been hearing some feedback from the team about how the product backlog isn't really quite as clear as they'd like to see it be when we get into sprint planning. And so what do you think we could do together as a team to make that happen, And they're going to kind of just come in with this gentle questioning model, which I always thought of as the positive aspect of servant leadership, was this idea of using powerful questions. And it's still something I'm a big fan of and that I think is going to be implied here by true leadership.
Yeah, so I think that answers your question, Karthikeyan. I believe, and what we are summarizing is we are saying that it's just that the word is removed, but true leaders or great Scrum Masters are going to embody, those practices to coach their product owners, without explicitly calling out that they are actually coaching the product owners.
Exactly. This is kind of like, if you know what it's like if you're married or something, right? You're in a relationship. Typically the best way to handle things is not to go in and say, yeah, I have a list of 5 suggestions for you about how to be a better spouse. Yeah, this doesn't tend to work out very well. So we're going to try to use that same kind of more subtle approach to how we coach, all the different roles, including not only just the product owner, but actually apparently the organizational leaders as well.
Yep. So there are no open questions, Steve, but I have one question that I'm getting onto my mind when I am talking to you especially on the scaling aspects, Steve. Right. So interestingly, the Scrum Guide started off with there is one product owner, one Scrum Master, and developers. Right, like a bunch of people. Yeah. Especially it says one Scrum Master, one product owner, and in the previous version there were a lot of confusions. Even though we try to emphasize that a Scrum Master and a product owner, is not recommended to be a same person because the outcomes are going to be suboptimal. The accountability, they will have to compromise one of the accountabilities and all that. What is your take on this, Steve? One Scrum Master, one product owner, and does it have an impact on the scaling aspects?
Yeah, it actually does very explicitly. There's another line in there that finally actually says what a lot of people were saying. The idea that if there is more than one team working on the same product, they seem to be explicitly saying there's a single product owner now for that product backlog that is shared among multiple teams. And this is effectively what some people, but not everybody, was interpreting as how you scale. So for example, one of my favorite, scaling mechanisms, or frameworks is less or large scale Scrum. And that's exactly how they interpret scaling, that there is a single product owner that has to maintain, a backlog, even when there's up to say 8 teams pulling off of it. But in order to be able to pull that off, you can imagine without dying as a product owner, you're going to have to empower your teams to do more of the stuff or delegate. And all of that feels incredibly consistent with this new Scrum guide to me, that what Les says for scaling feels like it's almost borne out now by the new version of the Scrum guide. As opposed to, say, a heavier model like SAFe, where it's a little less clear to me that, the idea of, empowered product owners, empowered Scrum masters that have organizational level responsibilities doesn't show up much in some of the models like SAFe.
Yep. So there's another question which we already discussed, but I just wanted to call out. How do we deepen the idea of product goal within the team as teams are currently struggling? Alberto, we already discussed that. I think it is emerging. How are we going to recommend product owners with respect to creating good product goals? I think it is very similar to sprint goals, but we got to really help the product owners frame good product goals. And we got to really discover some of the good practices, in my view.
So yeah, for Scrum Masters, I think maybe we should go out and try to help find some good examples and find ways to share that within our team. What are people doing with this new thing? Because we are supposed to be kind of these thought leaders. These, it also made it a little more clear in the new version of the Scrum Guide that we own making sure everybody understands Scrum really well. Kind of this "are we trainers" thing. It doesn't exactly say we're trainers, but it sure seems to be clear we have to make sure people are trained. And so I think it's part of our job now to help everybody understand these changes too, and to attend things like this, do reading, go to these different blog articles, be able to explain to our teams about what's changing here. Because in a lot of ways, this is more clarification than changes, but there are a few real changes. And one of them is certainly that idea of the product goal. So to be able to help explain that to the product owner. And I think it would be a good true leader style if I went in and helped make sure they understood it well. And then they're the ones that explain it to the team. And I just sit back and smile. And it's not like, oh, look, I was the source of all wisdom here. It's more like I helped the product owner in the background. And now the product owner is doing their role to explain this, idea of a product level thing. And they own product level things. But maybe I help them know enough to do that effectively.
Yeah, that's a good take. I hope that answered your question, Alberto. So the last question for you, Steve. Thank you very much. Before I close, I wanted to ask you, I had a question from a couple of candidates. I just wanted to understand your perspectives because you're bringing in a lot of experience. There's a statement in the Scrum Guide in 2017, Scrum is simple to understand, difficult to master. But they have removed that, in the 2020. To me, surprisingly, they have removed it. What's your view on that, Steve?
Yeah, I think this one is really interesting because it's sort of like, in some sense, I wanted to say, back to them, well, maybe it never was that simple to understand. I mean, in some sense, it's a simple framework, is true, but it wasn't really simple to understand. I mean, a lot of us have spent, significant portions of our lives trying to help explain and interpret what this means, right? So I while I hope that the intent is still true, that this is something I think we should all understand, it is difficult to master, but maybe that statement about it being simple to understand was a little bit of a stretch anyway. And so I suspect it went away more not for being wrong, but just because of how much they were trying to pare this down. I wouldn't read too much into it personally, but I just think it was one of those things that was editorial comments, and they had a lot of editorial comments in the older versions of the Scrum Guide, and they have removed the vast majority of them
now. That's a nice perspective, Steve. I think it is not simple to understand. Maybe it is simple to read, but it is not simple to understand.
And I know. I mean, some of us have been doing Scrum for decades, right? And yet every time you read the Scrum Guide, you often pick up some new implication or something. So it's always been a subtle thing. and that there was kind of little layers to it that you start to get into. And so, and there's a couple other small changes here we haven't talked about, like the thing about the size of the formerly known as dev team, right? That got clarified. So it's there's no longer that 3 to 9, or it used to be 5 to 9 dev teams. Now they sort of say, yeah, kind of 10 or less on the Scrum team ish, and so they've again softened this and given us more ability to do the right thing, if you will. Which isn't to say we shouldn't still think about that as pretty good guidance, by the way. That study after study shows that teams that are sized closer to like 5 or something tend to be better than teams that are closer to like 10. But again, they're leaving that up to us to determine.
I think that's it, Steve. I hope all of you guys enjoyed this conversation. Steve, thank you a ton for sharing your perspectives. Indeed, it was a very good learning session for me as well. And I'm sure I'm going to steal some of your statements when I teach back Scrum to some of my students.
Absolutely. It's great collaborating with you as always here, Venkatesh. And I hope everybody is, getting the message that we have an even more responsibility. If you're, many of you are here as Scrum Masters, I imagine, we have even more responsibility now to go out and help people understand all this and to do an even better job of, kind of changing the world of work. So appreciate people being here, and we're always happy to, to chat in the background. So, send us other messages if you have thoughts about this.
Pleasure is ours, Steve, and thank you very much for accepting and giving your valuable time. Thank you, guys. I look forward to seeing you guys in some other time. See you.